In this video, we're going to talk about oligopolies. This is the industry with a funny name. And we're going to motivate this by using a classic example of a two-firm industry. Right? So that's a duopoly when you have just two firms. That's the smallest number of firms that we can have without being a monopoly. And this is a kind of a duopoly called a Cournot duopoly, after this guy named, his last name was Cournot, Rene Cournot, who came up with this example of two firms in a really, really simple industry to motivate why you end up with these weird results. So this is a lake. In this classic example, you've got this lake, and you've got two people on either side of the lake, each of them selling water, right? Little bottles of water. And they're at the side of a lake to motivate the idea that this good is costless to produce. So they're just at the side of the lake, pumping out water, giving it to people, or not giving it to them, selling them. And what we want to figure out is, what will the price of water be in this example? What would it be if instead of being a duopoly, they were in a perfectly competitive industry? What would it be if they were a monopoly? And then compare those outcomes to see how they differ. So we do this partly because modeling an oligopoly with a graph is just a little bit more complicated. And what we're doing in this video is motivating something called strategic behavior. We're going to do this before we move on to game theory. So let's give our two sellers names, Joe and Gary. So Joe and Gary are trying to sell water, and this represents the demand for water in this market. So if they want to sell water, this is the demand curve they face, not individually, but for the entire market. Now, let's start by looking at this market demand and figuring out what would happen. So what would perfect competition do? Well, remember that in the long run, actually in the short run as well, they produce where price or is equal to marginal revenue, right? Price is equal to marginal revenue, and marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. That's the profit maximizing rule. Well, what's our marginal cost in this market? If this good was costless to produce, the marginal cost is zero. So in a perfectly competitive industry where it wasn't just Joe and Gary, but also all sorts of other people crowded around this lake selling water, well, eventually the price would be driven down to zero, right? Because you just have a bunch of people standing around pumping water out of the lake. If somebody tried to sell it for even 1 penny, you'd go to the person selling it for less. So the price gets driven down to zero. So that this becomes our perfectly competitive outcome. So in perfect competition, quantity is equal to 120, price is equal to 0. Okay? So in a perfectly competitive industry, that would be our outcome. Well, now let's think about so what would happen if a monopoly was controlling this industry, right? So it's not Joe and Gary, it's just one person. They are the sole owner of this lake. They decide what the price is. Well, remember that profit is total revenue minus total costs. And if our monopolist is a profit maximizer, they're going to choose the highest number here. Well, luckily we don't have to worry about total cost, because remember, this good is free to produce. So we just want to find the biggest number. Oh, there it is. That is the monopolist outcome. So in monopoly, the quantity would be 60. Price would also be, in this case, the price would be $60. So we've got our perfect competition outcome, we've got our monopoly outcome. Now we know from before, these are two opposite ends of the extreme. So we can make a prediction here. If we're trying to figure out what happens with a competitive structure that's somewhere in between, like an oligopoly, it's going to be somewhere between perfect competition and somewhere between monopoly. That means the perfectly competitive firm might have the lowest price and the highest quantity. So highest quantity, lowest price. The monopoly might have the highest price and the lowest quantity. Sure enough, that's what it is here, right? So oligopoly is going to be somewhere in between. Now what we'd like to do is see if we can come up with the outcome that we would predict would happen in this market once everything's settled down. Right? So we might anticipate that initially Joe and Gary are going to compete with each other as much as possible, but eventually we're going to reach an equilibrium. We remember equilibrium from our market model back in our second week. Equilibrium means that there's no incentive to change. So eventually we're going to come to a price and quantity where Joe and Gary figure out that there's no sense in competing anymore. I can't possibly do any better. If I deviate from this thing, I will make myself worse off. And that's going to be the basis of our game theory in a later lesson. So let's see what that outcome will be. Now, initially, they have no idea what the best quantity is, right? They're just spitballing. So they're just guessing at the best thing that they should do. So let's say Joe starts out with, I'm going to make 20, I'm going to pull out 20 gallons, and Gary says, yeah, I think they're not collaborating either. They're on opposite sides of the lake. They can't talk to each other. They just kind of decide, 20 sounds good. So that yields a market quantity of 40 gallons of water. So if they each produce 40 gallons of water, then the market price is $80. So let's see how each of our guys fared. What is their profit? So Joe's profit is total revenue minus total cost. Well, we don't have to worry about total cost, so it's just total revenue here, right? This is a costless good to produce. So price times quantity is 80 times 20, which is $1,600. And for Gary, oops, not price, profit for Gary is price times quantity, so 80 times 20 is $1,600. Okay, so now let's figure out if they can do any better. Okay? So Joe thinks, $1,600 is nice, but I'd like to make a little bit more money. What's going to happen if I up my game? I'm going to instead produce 30 units. So Joe decides to produce 30 units. Gary, he's not thinking much about it. He sticks to 20 units. So now our market quantity is 50 gallons. So let's take a look at that. That yields a price of $70. So our market price is now $70. Let's see how our guys fared. So Joe's profit is 70 times 30. Gary's profit is 70 times 20. So how did Joe do? Well, he did a lot better. He made more money, but Gary wakes up one morning to find out that all of a sudden his profits have gone down. He thinks, well, that's no good. What's going on? He looks around, he figures out that Joe has increased his quantity. Well, Gary says to himself, okay, maybe I should do the same. Now, Gary and Joe are at war. Price or in this case, a quantity war rather than a price war. So Gary says, well, fine. If you're going to do that, I'm going to produce 32. Joe thinks, well, that 30 worked for me last time. Let's see what happens if I stick to that. So Joe's profit, let's get the market quantity there. Our market quantity, if they both produce 30, is 60. Okay. And the price is $60. So Joe's profit, 60 times 60. Not 60 times 60, it's $60 times 30. Gary's doing the same thing, $60 times 30. He makes $1,800. Gary makes $1,800 too. That's where they stand right now. Now, let's take a note of something. This was the monopoly outcome. Gary and Joe would be a lot better off if they could just stop here. If they could do something called collude. If they collude, then they are acting as something called a cartel. A cartel is when oligopolists get together and act like they are a monopoly. They cannot make a higher profit as a group. Right? There is no higher profit in this market than $3,600. So the only way someone's going to end up making more money is if they take it from the other guy. But if you take it from the other guy is going to start trying to take it back from you. They'd be better here if they could stop here. But they don't do that because it's not in their best interest to do so. So what happens? Joe looks at Gary. Gary looks at Joe. Joe says, okay, well, maybe he's going to stick to making 30. What happens if I up my quantity? So Joe chooses 40. Gary chooses 30 still. So now our market quantity is 70, which means our price is $50. Joe's profit is $50 times 40. Joe says, oh yeah, that was the right choice. Forget sticking to this cartel. In fact, even if Gary and Joe agreed to it, right? Gary says, hey, Joe, we can't do better than this. Let's just stick here. Joe says, sure. And then says, wait a second, no. If I make more, I make more money. He breaks his agreement. He makes more. He makes a higher profit. So what's Gary's best response to that? Should he just take that lying down? Of course not. So what does Gary do? Gary says, well, I'm going to raise my quantity to 42. Now the market quantity is 80. The market price is 40. So Joe's profit is 40 times 40, 1,600, and, well, so is Joe's. So Joe thinks to himself, well, maybe I should do the same thing. Should I keep going? Yeah, I should keep going. So he says, I'm going to choose 50. Gary sticks to 40. Market quantity is 90. Price is 30. Profit for Joe is 30 times 50 is 1,500. Joe says, whoa, 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 wait a second. That was a bad move. I should not have done that. So I'm going to back off. Now let's just pretend this didn't happen. I'm going to back off. Now we've actually reached an equilibrium. This is our equilibrium. Once they get to this point, nobody has any incentive to change their quantity. This is the oligopoly outcome. The oligopoly outcome is you're going to end up with a market quantity of 80 units and a price of $40. Because once we hit this point, if you do anything differently, you're going to lower your profit. So they don't do anything differently. Did we end up where we predicted? Did we end up with a quantity that was between 120 and 60? Sure enough, we did. Did we end up with a price that was between 0 and 60? Sure enough, we did. Right? So this motivates the strategic behavior that is used by oligopolies to figure out what to do. In our next video, we're going to establish the rules of game theory, and we're going to start using something called a game matrix so that we don't have to go through this whole tedious operation of tit for tat back and forth. So that we can try to figure out what we would expect in situations where outcomes depend not just on what you do, but what your competitor does as well.